How do we overcome trauma in our lives? That's the question we're going to be addressing today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager. Flourish-Meant is sponsored by Access More. Today, I have a very experienced expert guest. Otis Ledbetter is an author, conference speaker, and the lead pastor at Sunrise Church in Clovis, California. He has a doctoral of ministry degree from Liberty University, and he's the author of Your Heritage: How to Be Intentional About the Legacy You Leave, and Soul Hunger, Satisfying Your Heart's Deepest Longing, as well as his new release, Set Free, Released from the Damage of Trauma. Welcome, Dr. Ledbetter. I am so delighted to have you on Flourish-Meant today.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you for having me and sharing your footprint with me, so I might get my message out.
Tell us a little bit about your heart for helping people get through trauma. Why did you select this particular topic in the broad range of things you could have addressed, having been in ministry for so long and written other books? Why was this something that you feel you were led to talk about in your recent release?
Actually, like some authors, you'll understand this. I thought Soul Hunger, my last book, would be my last book. I just was done with writing, and I mean, I've written all my life. Being a pastor, I manuscript all my sermons, and I told my assistant, I said, this is going to be my last one. And she said, yeah, right. But I really thought it would be. And I give part of my time to be on a nonprofit board. It's called Parenting Partners. And what we do is we go into independent school districts, and the government funds it, and they require it, so they fund it. And we go into independent school districts with a Parenting Enhancement Program. And we're in many of the southern independent districts. And I was sitting in a board meeting, and the president came in and he said, well, we've got something new from the Board of Education coming down from Washington, D.C. We've got to write a new curriculum, and the title of it would be Trauma Informed. Well, that caught my attention. Trauma Informed. What is trauma informed? I went on, and to find out what it was, I called the school district here in Fresno to find out what it was, and I had a talk with the gentleman that's in charge of that there, and I realized that what COVID had done to the children and to the parents of the children was now, as they were gathering back to school, the trauma that it caused was unbelievable. They couldn't teach the kids. The teachers couldn't get the kids in the classroom, couldn't teach. And in Fresno, unfortunately, the Fresno Unified, 90% of the kids live below the poverty line. 90%. And the trauma that was happening there, my heart I said, my heart can't take this. I've got to do something about it. And then I was listening to a speaker for Teen Challenge, which is a national organization. And he said it's about the only thing I took away from his talk was he has never heard a pastor from the pulpit address trauma. Never. And you know what I said to myself? I thought back, I said, I haven't addressed it straight on trauma. So I jumped in, started writing a series of sermons, 10 sermons on trauma. And when I got done with it, I realized how it affected the congregation. We're a Baptist church, and sometimes when you're preaching, they talk back to you, from the audience, if you've been in those churches. But when I was speaking on trauma, you could hear a pin drop. I mean, it was silent, and it was a little bit haunting and eerie. I got more feedback from this sermon series than I have in my entire ministry. I've been at this church 36 years, and the feedback I got from it was just incredible. So I said to my wife, I've got to write the book. I've got to put this in, because if my people needed it, more people are going to need it. So I wrote the book, and the rest is history. And I'm finding out from the book, the sales of the book and all of that, this is what people want.
Especially now with the rise in anxiety and depression among teenagers, even young children, and young new adults that are just emerging from high school. I feel, as a therapist and life coach, that these kids are going to present ongoing years and years of developmental related issues because their emotional needs, their social needs were not met when they were isolated during the pandemic. And that can cause like a domino effect of problems and issues if it goes unaddressed. What do you make of this trend, and how we as the church can begin to respond to that?
Boy, that's a really good question. And it definitely is a trend with a trajectory upward. That's the rate of suicide is just going out of sight. And every church, a church my size, the size that I pastor, um, it hits us more than once. Maybe not members, but people who attend know somebody. And so it's talked about, and we see it. And that's exactly the reason that I began to write the book. So in looking at it, I found, when I was digging in, I found these things. I found that the first thing that comes along seems to be fear. That's what COVID did. I mean, it took not just a nation, it took the world into the depths of fear. And then from fear comes anxiety. And anxiety and fear mixed together create in the person a moodiness, mood swings that sometimes they don't even know why their mood is swinging back and forth, but it's because of the fear and the anxiety, which leads to isolation. And that's where I said to myself, isolation brings on hopelessness and desperation, which then leads to the thought of ending your life. And so I looked in the scriptures, and I'm a pastor. I think everything should, well, the Bible is the best psychology book I've ever read. It, the one who wrote it, he's always willing to talk to you. He knows the essence of who I am because he made me, and the essence of who everybody else is. And his door's always open. His sign's always out. His what he answers to us are personal. Psychology tends to group people into behavioral groups, not the Bible. It goes to you individually and straight to the heart and for what you need. And then, his door's always open and his prognosis is always spot on. And so that's why I came from a spiritual component. And one more thing, if I could just say this. In my talk to the school district, people who were in charge, they were kind enough to sit down and talk to me while I was writing this book. Let me ask them questions. Now, the thing I noticed was in the educational system, not just here in Fresno, but across the nation, the trauma-informed was going to look at two phases of trauma. One was social, and the second was emotional. And I said, but it's a three-legged stool. It's not a two-legged. We humans, it's body, soul, spirit. There's two. What's the third one? And they told me government. Social, emotional, government. I said, no, that's not right. It's social, emotional, and spiritual. And we cannot leave the spiritual out, or you're trying to sit on a two-legged stool. And that's what they're trying to do. And that's why I don't think it's been as successful. The spiritual cannot be left out. So thus, I wrote the book from the spiritual standpoint. And when I went into the Bible, I found all of those people that we put on a pedestal, those plaster saints that we look at, they all suffered trauma. And the Bible shows us how they were brought out of it, how they were released from the damage of that trauma. And before I say anything else, I want to define trauma. That trauma is not an event. Most people think the traumatic event is the trauma. It's not. Trauma is the chronic reaction to that event That's why three people can have the same event and only one suffer trauma, because the others are reacting to that trauma. And so that's where I went with the book. And I think it's really helpful when people see these people that they put on a pedestal suffering the same thing they suffer.
That is so important, especially when we're talking about all ages of people, including children, to look at these issues from a holistic point of view, not just psychological, not just emotional and social, but also spiritual, because we are whole people and we need to address the whole person. And that spiritual part absolutely can't be left out. So I think this is going to be an important book for people to really look into from a church standpoint, from an educational standpoint, from a parent standpoint, or for anyone that's doing ministry to adults as well, or people to use for themselves. So
Indeed.
can you give us a link where we can contact you or stay following you and find a copy of your book for our own use or to recommend to others?
Indeed. It's if you go to JO, those are my initials, James Otis, JOLedbetter.com. and /books, and it'll take you right to the books. There's other things, blogs and other things on that site. But if you put /books, you'll go right to the books. And all 9 of my books are there. Set Free is at the top.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You've been very gracious and filled with wisdom. I hope that all of you listening have enjoyed this conversation and your interest is piqued in learning how to better respond to trauma in your life and in the lives of those around you. And of course, I also hope that you come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant. Flourish-Meant is part of the Spark Media Network and can be found on the Edify app.